We also have made some of the decisions which were quite difficult on the budgetary side, only based on criteria which are EU-centered. Talking about Maastricht, which is quite a popular topic these days, we have managed to have a debt burden of 29% compared to the GDP, which is quite low. We've never exceeded the 3% of public deficit on the annual basis, even in times of crisis. And none of this would have been able if we didn't have the quite restrictive assessment process that the European Commission makes on annual basis when you're a candidate country. Probably most of you have already forgotten about the scrutiny of this process of accession, but I think that the benefits are quite visible on the longer run, because without them we would have probably never been able to deliver results on that field. But the EU path has also been under pressure of a bilateral issue, and the fact that we are already candidate country since 2005, the same time as Croatia got candidate status. Just as a reminder, Croatia is going to join the European Union as the 28th member state a year from now, a year and a half actually, in 2013. And we have had consecutive recommendations to start accession negotiations since 2009 for 3 consecutive years. The decision-making process in NATO and EU has one particular point which is extremely important, and that is consensual decision-making. So the disagreement from one member state means that this decision cannot move further and will be stale. This is the reason, and particularly the only reason, for which we haven't been able to start this formal negotiation process. Now, probably the logical question would be why? And I think that very few remember why, including myself, as it has been some 20 years ago when the entire story started about Macedonia declaring independence and the perception of certain politicians in Greece that might mean territorial claims and unification and sort of threats that are completely irrational and do not make sense in NATO and EU. I believe that from today's perspective, it's not an argument that will make this case more difficult. It is more a question of being put in a hostage situation for a quite irrational issue, as relations between Macedonia and Greece have been really excellent at human and business level. One of our main trading partners is Greece. Most important investors in Macedonia are coming from Greece. But paradoxically, at the political level, we haven't been able to go over something which I would call a mythological threat, as none of the arguments that were presented in the 90s make sense from the perspective of the 20 years that have already passed. And it's quite valid when we make an assessment that we tend to forget or to defocus from the main objective only because the path was set on another role, on another goal. So what we need currently, and this is really an objective need from all sides, I would say EU, NATO, member states, and also candidate countries, is to refocus on these objectives. These objectives have been that joining NATO and EU provides you a secure area where you feel more comfortable and where you can focus on important things. And none of the bilateral issues that might emerge as relevant has any weight to compensate for the added value of membership. You also know, most probably in your experience, that even in difficult times, such as the current ones, when the crisis is threatening the overall view on the prospects to have prosperity in Europe under one currency, under same rules, under same perspectives, there hasn't been presented a better case than the current one. Meaning all those who have critical voices on how what are the prospects and how the Euro crisis will be handled have never proposed a better model or a better option than that. And that is quite consistent with what has been said from the very beginning, some 70 years ago, when the founding fathers of the European family were discussing on the ways how to avoid conflicts in Europe and how to set a road on a united continent which shares same values, same prospects, and same possibility for prosperity and open market. I think that what hasn't been said and what probably hasn't been that visible is that the burdens that you have managed quite successfully to overcome on this road in Southeast Europe still remain. And probably there we have to see which are the success stories that you can present and which are the cases that you made on your road. That is probably the kind of spirit in which each time when we have a regional discussion, when we mention the Baltic states, we say that this is a model that anybody should be inspired by. And when we're discussing in Southeast European context, it is something where we say there is space for improvement. That's a diplomatic formula to say that basically we are suffering from certain perception that the kind of cooperation that you have established at a regional scale hasn't been proven on the ground yet in another region. I think that this is only an incentive to draw a line between what are the reasons to have one approach on one part of Europe and another approach in another part of Europe. I think that the answer is quite simple, is maybe a contradiction, but that's a fact. Sometimes what you need to really focus on are the long-term objectives. And we haven't been successful in our region to focus on the longer-term objectives so far, only because we bared too much of a burden of the past experiences, which hasn't brought any positive dynamics on that side. It has been more of a story which is dominated by mythological questions. No one in Europe is discussing today the importance of borders. These are the kind of issues that some countries and some neighbors in the Balkans are still raising at different levels. But everybody knows that once you're in the European Union, borders do not matter. What matters is where you pay your taxes and how efficient is your system. That's about it. The rest will remain to the overall package and the decision-making process that is made. So currently, I think that we have quite good opportunity to set Southeast Europe on the road and through a door that remains open. These are the official positions, and they have been confirmed on each one of the occasions when we have these forums between both NATO and EU and candidate and potential candidate countries. To go from that perspective of having an open door, overcome all those burdens which are unrealistic, and set objectives which have been already defined for you and that have remained the same for us. There may be variations on the interpretation on when can we join that, but I think that it depends pretty much on us and depends pretty much on the member states themselves, which have a word on setting the agendas and setting the priorities. We have had few particular challenges in our region, which still remain to be answered. But I think that without the incentive of this future membership into both NATO and EU, none of them would have been easy to overcome. I mentioned also the economic dimension and the current crisis, because it has been proven also that the kind of behavior that we favor does not correlate to the status that we have within one or the other family. Meaning you can be in a quite advanced stage and having difficulties currently because of one way of managing your economy, your budget, and showing capacity to restructure in difficult times. And you can have a different phase, which will be less advanced, but in which you will manage to deliver results on each one of these chapters. And that has been probably less visible from a candidate country's perspective, but it is definitely visible from the member states' perspectives, and it remains to be the case. What we would like to see in the coming period is that those who have benefited from both processes, NATO and EU integration, raise their voice on the importance of having success stories also in other parts of Europe. And I think that there we will definitely all benefit from it. What is quite obvious on a global scale today is that the challenges that Europe is facing are affecting its importance and its weight on a global scale. Some of the countries that didn't have that weight some decades ago today are coming up on the international scene. And the capacity of Europe to present a case and to remain in a rather comfortable position, but because we should never forget that what is a common acquisition, a normal standing, a normal way of living in Europe is only an aspiration in other parts of Europe, of the world. And this should guide us also in our decision-making processes in the future. If we want to remain that on that path, it will require probably constant efforts, and it will require also remembering where we are starting from. And this is something that appears to be less visible at different stages of integration process, and it has also remained challenge in the current dealing with the debt crisis. Probably you are in a very comfortable position to judge on this added value because you have experienced the process. You have seen what it looked like when you're joining, what kind of efforts do you need to deliver in order to make your story a success one, and you have seen also what it brings on the other side when you don't need to deal with a certain number of issues such as security, stability, once you're in that family. So that bit of having stable Europe, which will integrate all of us in the same setup, is also provides you with a nice view on where your future lays. Because once you get out of the university, you'll probably find yourself in an environment which will show you that life is not that simple, and that in one part of the world or the other part of the world, the challenges that you might face on a daily basis can be different. That is easier for you. It is also quite easy to understand it from a candidate country perspective, but it is only at the stage where we will all be around the same table that we will be able to make an assessment on what has been going on in the last 2 decades. I'm very glad that the cooperations that we are establishing at bilateral levels and at regional levels are quite helpful for Southeast Europe, and that the Baltic states, in that sense, have set some benchmarks which have been the guiding principles in our cases. One of the aspects that we have been discussing in the past period is that within Europe, distance is less important. So if trade wasn't possible some decades ago across Europe on 2,000 kilometers distance, this is changing these days. Services are gaining, and some of the countries that never had any exchanges in the past now do. And they do cooperate in substantial areas, such as the capital transfers and such as the provision of services at a distance. We would like to show this positive case of regional cooperation in our region and set some benchmarks for the future cooperation, in which there will be certainly space for working quite extensively on the bilateral relations. We would like also to see that what we are trying to make in our region is not just a project, but it's something that can come true. The open door policy is probably the most important item in this story, and it is the most important incentive for introducing further changes in the coming period. And on that side, I think that it is quite important, and it is never enough that it is repeated. We'll keep knocking, that's for sure, and we'll keep making progress in the meantime. I think that the decisions that will need to be made in the coming years will definitely change the future of our region, and will make us be on the other side of the door, as the cases have shown that we are able to do it. I think that the easiest way to deal with the coming challenges would be to leave you ask the right kind of questions that I will try to answer, and which will set the priorities for us to see what are the things that you think are feasible for Southeast Europe and that have been the largest achievements in the Baltic states and in Latvia in particular. Thank you.
Minister, thank you. Thanks for the broad overview. And before I open the floor to the Q&A session to students, because I strongly encourage everybody to participate and raise the questions, to use this excellent opportunity to understand more what's happening, what are the developments in South Europe and potentially among our allies. I would use the privilege of being a moderator of this session, and I would raise the question. Chicago summit is approaching, and last week you, Minister, been also to the Washington DC, and you met the people from administration. You gave a presentation at Atlantic Council. United States support, I think, is an important, very instrumental support to advance, especially the NATO integration and NATO membership. Even though in 2008 in Bucharest, unfortunately, it was not enough. How do you see, what are the opportunities this time for Chicago summit, and what are still remaining obstacles? Because as we know, there are remaining obstacles, and I think the students also would be happy to learn a little bit more about, let's say, what are those challenges ahead of the NATO membership?
What has been quite valid argument, I think, for the Baltic states is a valid argument for Southeast Europe, and especially for Macedonia. The United States have been one of the strongest supporters, and they have been definitely committed to close the enlargement chapter in Southeast Europe. Chicago summit is only 2-3 months from now. In our perspective, it is not the key benchmark, knowing the current context and the fact that the main issues that will be discussed there will be more of a strategic point of view, where NATO will focus in the future, what will be the fate of ISAF mission in Afghanistan, and the enlargement as such will not be the main bullet point. That is not, seen from Macedonian perspective, that is not a major handicap, because what the Bucharest summit concluded was that Macedonia was ready to join NATO at any stage, given that the bilateral issue with Greece is settled. That means also that in the meantime we have shown that we are acting as a de facto member state. We are one of the largest contributors in NATO-led ISAF mission, and the only deficiency at the moment is that we are not enjoying the benefits. That's a case that we made also with our American friends, and what they have also agreed with is that the fact that Macedonia is not able to have a seat at this stage around the NATO table in Brussels is quite a problem for the alliance itself. What has been also concluded and observed is that the bilateral issue is not a factor that affects the importance of having Macedonia on board. If we go backwards, the story goes that recognizing Macedonia was perceived in Greece as a territorial threat. What can make you feel more secure from that perspective than having all your neighbors within NATO? And if Macedonia joins NATO, Greece will only have borders with NATO member states. On the side of the threats, they have been confirmed as literally mythological ones, as the only invasion that happens from Macedonian side to Greece is the 500,000 Macedonians going on Greek beaches in July, and that's about it. So that's not relevant neither. The fact that we have human-to-human, business-business relations at an excellent level is another confirmation that none of the threats that were stated in the 90s is of any relevance at all. So what we are facing realistically on the ground is that some statements, some political decisions were made in the 90s, which were not based on facts, but rather mythology, and on which it is quite difficult to step back now. And this has delayed, let's say, the process in a quite substantial manner. If you look at the substance of the entire bilateral issue, I think, it is pretty irrational. I can name a number of examples where territories and regions in Europe do not correspond to the borders of countries, plenty of them. If the same logic would have applied, then Luxembourg should have never joined the NATO and EU, because there is a region of Luxembourg in Belgium and also in Germany. But that wasn't the case neither. And I think the key point would be that NATO maybe should focus on its own long-term interests, where all member states will find their added value. And I think that there is added value in Macedonia joining NATO from NATO itself, from Macedonia perspective, from Greek perspective as well, because I mentioned the fact that this will mean that Greece will only have borders with NATO member states, and it will definitely mean, it will definitely make sense for the entire region, because this will allow to make a statement that the enlargement has been a logical one. You fulfill criteria, and when you fulfill them, you join the club. So it will allow us to keep the credibility on the balance. Last but not least, it is also what the legal advice is saying. So in 2008, when we faced the blockade in Bucharest, we filed a court case in the International Court of Justice on the perspectives of illegality of vetoing Macedonia's accession to the EU. What the World Court has said on that was that the blockade was illegal because of the non-respecting of one single principle in the interim agreement. In the 90s, when we declared independence, the first reaction was blockade and hostilities. We shouldn't forget that at the northern border, we had Serbia, which was practically in war and on which there were UN sanctions. And on the south flank, we had Greece that imposed an economic embargo. Because of the fact that there was no east-west circulation, we were de facto hermetically closed country at that stage, suffering from blockades on both sides. On the east, there was the falling Iron Curtain and Bulgaria. On the west, there was Albania that was just exiting from dictatorship and was probably the most isolated country in Europe. So that suffering on the economic side and really the squeezing of the economy has made European countries and America intervene to ease this situation and led us to the interim agreement. This interim agreement is quite asymmetric kind of agreement, which on one side sets a number of requirements, including change of constitution, flag, making explicit statements on the fact that there is no territorial claim, there are no threats, basically fulfilling all the questions or the conditions asked from the Greek side. On the other side, it had only one benefit, and that benefit was that Greece has taken the burden of not objecting to Macedonia's membership in any international club if it is done according to the interim agreement. And that means that the organization uses the reference in communication with Macedonia, not Macedonia to the organization, and none of the bilateral communications. So that one single principle was broken at the Bucharest summit. And what the World Court has concluded out of it is that it is an illegal behavior and it shall not be repeated into the future. So I think that the legal argument is one of them, but what is really providing the strongest argument are all these added values that NATO, Macedonia, Greece and the entire region will draw benefits from if we are able to join the NATO family. Coming back to your Chicago question, the agenda is not set, but the agenda doesn't say anything about enlargement at this stage. What it can say is that there is this open door policy on which we have been knocking for quite some time, and we hope that what will prevail are these interests that I'm mentioning and not imaginary threats that have only complicated life and decision making.
Okay, dear Minister, so let's open the floor. Yeah, please.
So I'm going from the second year of the European Studies, and I wanted to thank you for your presentation. And I wanted to ask, how is your opinion about Macedonia, the Macedonian Republic, joining the EU? Also because of Greece in this case, because as we see now, the Greek politicians don't seem to be very reasonable, as we can see in the financial problems that they have right now, and that they still make demands which are not really possible.
Well, thank you for your question. At the first sense, most of people believe that because of the complex situation in Greece, to put it mildly, the name issue will become a non-issue and Greece will have even more incentives to show a bit more reason on that file. What has been proven in practice is quite the opposite, actually. That the fact that they're dealing probably with one of the most serious crises for ages made them completely defocus from that issue and made, let's say, the decision-making process in our respect even less logic and interest-based. So if you look at it from a political point of view, the current Greek government, among the top 1,000 priorities, do not have resolving the bilateral issue. On the other hand of the balance, on our political schedule, joining EU and NATO is top of the priorities. There isn't any more important goal than that one. And this disbalance in priorities and the pressure that they might feel on the ground on daily basis, and the lack of pressure on another file makes it less likely that moves will happen. And it has been proven also in the dialogue where there hasn't been any show up for or manifest for constructive dialogue on this issue. It has been more a strategy or delaying any substantial discussions and simply avoiding or hoping that it will not be part of the schedule. I don't think, on the other hand, I guess that this was the idea of your second bit of the question, financial crisis and the effects on us on that. We have practically suffered quite a lot because of the exposure. For example, 1/4 of the banking sector in Macedonia is owned by Greek banks. And these are the only parts of the Greek banking sector that are still generating profits. Their mother banks are close to bankrupt, and they're still generating profit in Macedonia because of the market not being exposed to these sort of risks. It has also presented the case for us that joining EU doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe on the economic side. Quite the opposite. We are a candidate country for almost 7 years, have 3 consecutive recommendations to start negotiations, but are not a member state, but we still managed to have 29% of the GDP in terms of overall debt, and we still managed to be fully in the Maastricht criteria in terms of budget deficit. So it is probably more a question of responsibility than a question of being or not within the club and having, let's say, the benefit side.
Yeah, please.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Ilya Dimitrovsky. I'm from Macedonia.
Okay. Do you know that we had Macedonia?
I've known since 5 years. I'm currently doing fellowship at Riga Graduate School of Law, Public International Law and Human Rights. And I have like 2 questions. My honor to ask you. The first question is regarding our position after the judgment from the International Court of Justice in our favor. It's the current position of Macedonia now in international level. And also, as I read now in the news, is that as one minister, the Minister of Defense said that maybe we will accept also to join NATO under our reference name like FIROM, which I hate. It's our official name under the UN. And the second is the second question is about regarding EU. How is now the real atmosphere of Macedonian ordinary people? Because since I know like 5 or 7, no, since we are candidate state, the expectation of Macedonian people were very high of joining EU, and how is the atmosphere now?
I'm glad that the Vice Rector was right when he told me that you have international students at the university. It shows to be the case. I'm glad that you're asking these questions. Also, well, on the ICJ judgment, so I've given the background of it. I don't think that anybody wants to file a case unless he's really constrained in this respect. So our decision to file this case was made on the prospects of not being able to resolve it through political means. And in a family where rule of law is a core value, such as both NATO and EU, it really made sense that we make a point on the legal side. What the ICJ court ruling says is that, number one, the decision of Greece to block our NATO membership in Bucharest is illegal from international law perspective. That's a point that we are making clearly. It also sets a number of answers to all the claims from the Greek side. For example, one of them was the fact that renaming the airport was breaching to international law. What the World Court said, that's not the case. They have practically rejected all the counter-arguments from the Greek side. Our current position goes along the lines of rule of law. It really makes sense. There are benefits on one side, but there is also the legal confirmation from that. However, those of you who are in the political sciences departments, can you raise just hands to have an idea of how many of you are doing politics? Not many? Okay, still some. Okay. You will be probably in better position to understand than the economists and the others in the room that there is law, but in politics it seems that political decision-making does not always take into account what is legal and illegal. And that's a stance that has been objective in assessing the Greece's reaction on the ICJ court. So the way they have reacted was fair enough. That might be a legal perspective, but there is still a political reality, which is we are a member state, and we sit on that table in Brussels, and you don't. And they haven't shown any signs that they will be keen to, let's say, follow the legal pattern or the legal the legal decision making on that sense. I think that it could really make sense that this shifts and that that we come back to what is reasonable, to what is legal, and not to step up from a position of force. Of course, when you're a member state, you feel more comfortable, and of course, when you're a candidate, you feel the entire pressure on you. But if we start abusing from this position, when we know that the objective is that we are all part of the same family, then we are losing out of the focus what is the main idea on it. On the what you have mentioned, the form of joining NATO. What the ICJ court ruling made clear also is the fact that the interim agreement only determines the way that the international organization refers to us when Greece is member of it. It does not refer to the way we address to the international organization, and it has zero weight whatsoever in bilateral relations with every other country. So from that perspective, the application in Bucharest was made in compliance with the interim agreement, and that was clear. And there is no argument that can be said under this or that form. We have a framework. That's the legal framework in the bilateral relations that we have with Greece. It has been violated by only one side. That's Greece. This is the factual situation. On the EU perspectives, what the opinion polls are showing is that the fact that we have been in a position to have 3 consecutive recommendations to start negotiations, the Commission is backing that, and the Council cannot much consensus only because of Greece's opposition, is that the credibility of the process has been challenged. So on questions like how credible the process of enlargement is, obviously we have suffered. But we still remain the country with the largest support for both European Union and NATO, which has never dropped practically below 90%. It can be also correlated to the path that one follows. There is a theory that closer you get, lower the support is. But I don't really believe that this is of any relevance, because we have constantly maintained over a period of 15 years practically a support over 90%. It has never dropped below. So I hope that we will maintain it in the future as well.
Good. Thank you, Minister.
Nikols Poposkis, research fellow at Latvian Institute of International Affairs. So my question is related with the NATO Smart Defense Initiative. And during crisis and the situation when the Europe countries are in sharp decline of defense budgets, and the gap between the United States and Europe NATO members are growing. So there is the new initiative of smart defense, and it certainly will be also one of the key points in the upcoming Chicago summit. So my question is, what is Macedonian opinion on the smart defense? Are you going to undertake any significant changes in your defense policy, security policy, considering your defense budget, force structure, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Just a few figures. Our defense expenses are roughly 3% of the GDP, so in these terms we are even above what would be a NATO standard as an overall. On the side of expenses, half of our defense budget is dedicated to NATO-led missions, so that's quite substantial from a taxpayer's perspective. On the practical projects that we would like to undertake, before the Bucharest summit, the initiative backed by the United States was to take an A3 team of Croatia, Albania and Macedonia towards NATO membership. In this framework, we have established a number of mini smart defense projects, if you wish, where we have thought about possibilities to draw our capacities together and plan our actions as an overall contribution. The United States of America has been the leading country. After Bucharest, there has been an extension of this club with Bosnia and Montenegro, who have started basically their reforms on the path to join NATO. In the meantime, 2 countries have joined NATO, Croatia and Albania. For us, I have told the story why we haven't. Within the A5, what we are trying to do in concrete terms, and it is concentrated on the Afghanistan mission currently, is to have smart defense projects develop on assisting Afghan forces to take over ownership of security on the ground. One of the concepts that we have elaborated and we are quite advancedly working on is having joint teams of trainers for Afghan police forces and military police forces and their security teams to be trained. The other one is to identify a number of areas where we can have joint forces units. One of them has also the EU flag on it, a Southeast European brigade, in which each one of these countries is a contributor, and we have basically a brigade that is deployable, composed of different materials and troops from the different countries of the region. It is something that is required and will be even more necessary because we have an extended number of countries where the defense budgets are shrinking. In our case, even in the critical times that we are facing and feeling the consequences, for example, of having one of our main trade partners suffering a major economic crisis, there are few budget lines which haven't been affected by budgetary cuts. One of them is the defense budget. The second one is judiciary because of the reforms. And I think that on that side, even in these difficult times, where it is practically an obligation to have budgetary restrictions on all budgetary lines, these are not going to be affected. So smart defense, whether or not it will be on the agenda, I think that you have the right answer. It will be definitely on the agenda in Chicago. But for us at the regional scale, will be one of the focuses in the coming period. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm studying political science for the first year. So, well, you mentioned you have a very big, large, society's support for the EU. But I have a question whether they actually do understand what that means, whether it's just result of huge propaganda or something. And yes, and the other question is how do you plan to, well, what are your solutions for the social problems and social issues? You've mentioned a lot of economical solutions, but, well, you have a large community of Albanians, and, well, maybe Latvia can study what are your solutions, because we have similar problems with a large population of other ethnic society. Yeah. So.
Yes. On the first question, quite legitimate one, support for the EU and why we have had such an extensive support. I think that one of the reasons is that we have created this image that Europe provides solutions for everything. I think that we have shifted away a little bit from the purpose of the European project. If we go backwards to probably the first discussions when Adenauer, Monnet and Schuman were discussing about the possibilities to have a prosperous area after a major conflict on this continent, the objective was to unite people. That's one of the main ideas, not to unite countries, but people. I think the major acquisition and the most important thing of the European Union is the internal market. That you make an area, a market of 500 million people, where the flow of persons, capital, goods, services will be free. In that kind of concept, the economic interests will prevail over security threats. That is the idea behind it, and I think that this is the major acquisition of Europe, and no one has thought of or has realized a more successful project to achieve peace and stability in Europe. That's the first perspective. Out of that, there are many deviations which I think are probably misunderstandings of the European project. One is the myth that it solves all your problems by itself. No. I think that you can only solve your problems by your own. Number two, where it started from, set of rules and respecting of rules. Maastricht criteria were not set for the purpose of having a conference in Maastricht, but to set the rules in order to avoid major destabilizations at the macroeconomic policy level. So if you forget somewhere on the road why these rules were set at some stage, then obviously the tendency of deviation is another one. The third one, the myth that you get funding in illimited quantities, and that by that way you should probably have less incentives to work or to spend your energy, because Europe will transfer money and will solve your problems. That's also not really true. So maybe we should come back to the basic principles, and I think that they're still visible in Macedonian case. In our part of Europe, the past has been dominated by conflicts. So if you calculate the number of conflicts over the past century, then you realize that there is, I would say, a tendency to be fearful of conflicts in the future. Why we get that support for the EU? In that kind of societies, it's quite easy to understand that what EU is about is eliminating these security threats. It doesn't make sense to discuss change of borders in the European Union when they don't exist in practice. They're administrative borders. It also enables you to focus on economy more and less on tiny political issues about who thinks what about his neighbor. I think in the societies of democracy, you are the one who will decide what's your name, what's your identity, what language do you speak, and what do you prefer to do in your future life. And sometimes we tend to forget that this is the freedom and the spirit and the internal market that are the main ideas of the European Union. So I'm quite confident that we'll manage to get this support, even though I can agree with the fact that closer you get, probably the support goes down. Whether it's correlated to the level of awareness of people, that's a very good question. And I think it's a very good question also for within the member states. If you make a poll on concrete questions of the European Union, in any member states as in candidate countries, I think you'll have difficulties to find a critical mass of people who will really thoroughly understand what's certain legislation for and what will be the consequences of it. So probably there is a lot of space for interpretation. But the basic values and this idea about having stable and prosperous Europe within the EU framework is a valid argument. And I think that people really understand it because of our past and the fact that we have experienced major security threats. And practically the region has been unstable for a number of years. On the social problem side, probably the biggest problem at the moment is, and not in the moment, but also structurally and constantly has been the high level of unemployment. We have been part for a number of decades of the Yugoslav Federation, where the economic decisions were not based on economic logic, but more on policy engineering somewhere in Belgrade. So we have inherited an industry that was overwhelmingly dominated by the fact that we need to provide work for everyone. All these industries have generated unemployed people in a structural manner, which cannot be converted on a short run in another industrial sector. And that's a social problem. The roughly 35 to 40% of our budget is based on social welfare. So basically transferring money from those who create wealth to those who once used to work in the huge industrial complexes that do not have the market of former Yugoslavia of 25 million inhabitants, but are restricted to today's realities. That's the main problem. And this is what causes, let's say, the risks on the long run. The fact that we have quite complex mixture of ethnic, religious communities, etc., has represented a threat over a number of years at the regional scale, not on the national, because if you look at it, it's, I mean, not uniquely on the national, because if you look at the Balkans, there isn't a single state which has a homogeneous national composition within itself. But it has also provided us with assets for the future, and it has helped us to understand or to see in a better manner that this European framework has a lot of advantages. because there, I would say the belonging to one or other religious or ethnic group becomes less relevant. And then you can focus on individual rights and get out of the concept of one ethnicity or one religious group against another. And that's something that has been managed only thanks to EU and NATO. Even at the times when we were facing major threats, I'm talking about the region, so a major conflict in Bosnia, tensions between Kosovo and Serbia on the path to its independence, also in Macedonia some 10, 11 years ago. All these issues were practically resolved because of the messages that were sent. You guys are going to be part of the European Union. None of the things that you're discussing currently would be relevant within this family, because the set of rules will be there and you will be able to focus on other kind of stories. I don't think that there is a model that should be copied by anyone. I think that everybody has a particular kind of setup, and I'm not in favor of copy-paste solutions in any case, because we are all individuals and we have all our individual setup, which if proven successful to one place, does not necessarily mean that it will be successful in another place. What we should focus on probably is the values and the overall interest of the larger community. That will help us to overcome any of these issues. That is my personal belief.
Minister, many thanks. We are running out of time, and I can just give a few words the concluding side. Thanks for the providing those insights, because I think it gives us understanding that many things what Latvia has experienced and also what Macedonia is experiencing right now, because experience are very similar. It's not just about that sometimes Baltics are being confused with Balkans and probably vice versa. It's not that we are both 2 million population size nations with quite considerable proportions also of ethnic minorities. But I think it's about processes. What we faced during the last decades are very similar. State building, nation building, Euro-Atlantic integration, sharing the global risks and global threats together. We are allies in NATO and Afghanistan, actually, and let's hope that one day we are full-fledged allies in EU and NATO as members of EU and NATO. So, of course, we wish you all the successes to the road to NATO and then to EU as well. So thank you very much, and please join me in applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, very good.
I think that made sense. This is what